Ever get the feeling that you're running in place financially, working harder and harder, but not really getting ahead?
Yeah, like you're stuck on a treadmill. Going through the motions, but not actually going anywhere.
Exactly. And today, we're going to dive into some really thought-provoking ideas that might explain why so many people feel that way.
It should be interesting.
It really is. We're going to be looking at the perspective of Gary Stevenson. He's a former trader who's got some pretty fascinating insights into wealth and the economy.
From what I've read of his stuff, he doesn't shy away from challenging conventional wisdom.
Oh, not at all. He's got some pretty strong opinions. And one of the things that jumps out right away is this core argument he makes. The massive concentration of wealth at the very top is like a black hole. It's like an economic vacuum cleaner sucking the wealth away from everyone else.
It's a pretty stark image, right? Like it really drives home the point he's making.
It does, doesn't it? And it makes you think about all those common explanations we hear for why people are struggling. Like immigration or whatever the political flavor of the month is.
Right, the go-to scapegoats.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But Stevenson says, no, 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 that's not the root cause. He argues that it's this runaway wealth accumulation at the top that's really driving things. Like, how sometimes you lose your socks and you blame the dryer.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But really, they were just under the bed the whole time.
Happens all the time.
It's kind of like that. We're looking in the wrong place for the answer.
And what makes Stevenson's perspective even more interesting is that it's not just theoretical for him. He was a trader during the 2008 financial crisis, so he saw firsthand how traditional economic solutions can sometimes fail spectacularly.
Right. Like, think about what happened after Lehman Brothers collapsed. Central banks slashed interest rates to almost zero.
Textbook economics says that should have jump-started the economy. More borrowing, more investment, boom, recovery, right?
Exactly. But that's not what happened.
Not even close.
I mean, for years, everybody was saying, oh, rates are going up next year, next year. But it just kept not happening. It wasn't until COVID-19 hit and everything got turned upside down that things really started to shift.
So the economy was like a patient that just wasn't responding to the usual treatment.
It was. And Stevenson realized that those low interest rates weren't doing anything to boost demand because the wealth was so concentrated. Even with practically free money, people weren't spending.
That's so counterintuitive, right? You would think people would be out there borrowing and spending like crazy.
Yeah, you would.
Yeah.
But Stevenson, he went out and actually talked to ordinary people to find out why they weren't spending more. Which, sounds almost too simple, but...
But sometimes the simplest answers are the most revealing.
Right. So what did he find out? What was the main reason people were holding back?
Well, the answer was pretty straightforward. They just didn't have the extra cash. They were already stretched thin, just trying to make ends meet. Their budgets were tapped out.
Oof, yeah, I can relate to that.
I think a lot of people can. And what Stevenson realized was that this was part of a bigger trend, a decline in wealth ownership among the middle class compared to their parents. Things like home ownership, which used to be almost a given, were becoming increasingly out of reach.
Like trying to climb a ladder where the rungs keep getting farther apart.
Exactly. You just can't seem to get a grip. And Stevenson connected this to what he was seeing happening with government finances, especially in the UK and the US, around 2011.
What was he seeing there?
Well, he noticed this parallel between the financial struggles of the working class in the West and the growing debt burdens of Western governments. Both were kind of losing wealth and going deeper into debt at the same time, and he realized that's logically impossible.
Unless that wealth is going somewhere else.
Exactly. It's like a seesaw. One side can't go down unless the other side is going up.
Makes sense.
Mm.
So where did Stevenson think all this wealth was ending up?
Well, working in Canary Wharf, surrounded by all those high-flying financiers managing vast fortunes, gave him a pretty clear idea. He saw that the wealth wasn't disappearing, it was piling up at the very top.
The black hole in action.
Exactly. It's being drawn away from the middle class, the working class, even from the government itself.
And he uses the example of Rishi Sunak, right? Someone with immense wealth that just keeps generating more wealth through passive income.
Yeah, and that's a key part of his argument. When you have people earning millions every year just from their investments, far more than they could ever spend, that surplus capital has to go somewhere. And what Stevenson argues is that it gets reinvested, often inflating the prices of things like houses and stocks.
So it's not just that the rich are getting richer, it's that their wealth is growing faster than the overall economy, and they're basically squeezing everyone else out in the competition for these assets.
Right, they're playing in a different league financially. It's like they're at a small auction where they have an unlimited budget.
So when we see house prices skyrocketing or the stock market booming, Stevenson says, hold on, this isn't necessarily a sign of a healthy economy. It could be a symptom of this wealth concentration, with the super rich just outbidding everyone else.
It's a different way of looking at those economic indicators.
It is. And then he brings in the COVID-19 pandemic and all that unprecedented government spending.
Yeah.
A lot of people saw those stimulus checks and those business loans as a lifeline.
A much-needed boost, for sure.
But Stevenson looked at it through the lens of inequality. And he asked a very important question. Who is actually going to benefit the most from all this spending?
Yeah, it's kind of like throwing a life preserver into the water without really checking to see who's actually drowning.
Right. So what did he conclude?
Well, he pointed out that while some of the money definitely helped workers who were furloughed, it mostly just replaced lost wages. It didn't really increase their overall wealth. And a lot of businesses were forced to close, so they weren't exactly raking in profits either. So where did all those trillions go?
Yeah, it's like a financial mystery. Where did all the money disappear to?
Well, Stevenson says it ended up primarily benefiting the customers of non-essential businesses, especially those in the luxury sector. During lockdowns, all those high-end shops and restaurants were closed, so wealthy people with tons of disposable income suddenly couldn't spend it on their usual things.
So they were forced to save.
Exactly. And then the government pumped all this money into the economy. Some of it went to service workers who then used it to pay their rent and mortgages. And who owns most of those assets?
Wealthier individuals.
You got it. So the money flowed, but because of the concentration of asset ownership, it flowed upwards.
So the lockdown was like a giant forced saving scheme for the wealthy.
That's what Stevenson argues. He even compares it to a form of money laundering. Trillions flowing from the government through the economy and ultimately settling at the top.
Which then leads to problems when the economy reopens, right? He predicted inflation and a decline in living standards.
Exactly, because now you've got an economy restarting with even greater wealth inequality. The rich are flush with cash, while most people are still struggling to get by, and that extra demand from the wealthy, combined with all the supply chain issues, pushes prices up.
Inflation city.
And with more wealth disparity, the rich can just keep bidding up the prices of assets, making things like housing even more unaffordable.
So what's the solution? Stevenson says we need to tax the rich, but he's very specific about this. He says we need to tax wealth, not just income. What's the difference?
Well, he points out that our current tax system already taxes income from employment pretty effectively. His target is the vast pools of assets held by the super rich, the stuff that generates passive income without them having to actually work.
Like someone with £1 billion who just sits back and lets their money make more money.
Exactly. He uses the example of family offices, these teams of professionals who manage the wealth of the ultra-rich. They're constantly searching for opportunities to buy undervalued assets.
And that puts them in direct competition with ordinary people who are just trying to buy a home.
Right. If a property comes up for sale at a price they consider a bargain, they can snap it up. No problem. It's like they're playing a different game entirely.
And Stevenson, he even shares a personal anecdote about buying gold at the start of COVID because he anticipated that asset prices would go up with all that money flowing to the wealthy.
And he was right. Gold prices doubled. He says house prices haven't quite doubled, but that's partly because it's harder for the super rich to buy up massive numbers of individual houses. But the upward pressure is definitely there.
And he emphasizes that this isn't just a UK issue. He says you see the same trends in major cities all over the world. Housing prices are soaring, stocks are going up, luxury goods are becoming more and more expensive.
It's a global phenomenon. And he argues that it all points back to this fundamental driver, the increasing concentration of wealth.
Now, to illustrate the potential impact of taxing wealth, Stevenson uses this kind of extreme thought experiment. What if we taxed the richest people a huge amount and then just destroyed that money? What would happen?
It's not a realistic policy proposal, of course, but it's a way of thinking about the sheer scale of wealth at the top. He suggests that government debt would probably disappear overnight. And maybe even more importantly, housing would become much more affordable because the rich would have to sell off so many assets to pay the tax.
So it's a way of sort of resetting the system.
Yeah, but he acknowledges that a sudden collapse in house prices could also hurt a lot of middle-class families who have most of their wealth tied up in their homes. So he favors a more gradual approach.
Okay, so what does he actually propose?
His main idea is a 1% wealth tax on fortunes over £10 million.
Seems pretty reasonable when you consider how much these people are earning just from their investments.
Right. He points out that their annual returns are often way higher than 1%. And he says the revenue from this tax could be used to lower taxes on working people and to fund public services that are really struggling right now.
So it's not just about taking money away from the rich. It's about investing in the things that benefit everyone.
Exactly. Now, one of the main criticisms of taxing the wealthy is that they'll just move their money to other countries.
The classic tax haven argument.
Yeah, but Stevenson says that argument is based on a misunderstanding. He's not talking about taxing income, which is easier to move around. He's talking about taxing assets, the actual stuff that people own. And if someone owns £1 billion worth of British property, businesses, land, they can't just make that disappear by moving to Monaco.
True. Those assets are still here.
Exactly. And he makes the point that a strong working class with money to spend actually makes Britain a more attractive place to invest.
Because it creates a bigger and more stable consumer base.
Right. So taxing wealth could actually boost the economy in the long run.
Now, we also have to address the elephant in the room, which is immigration. It's often blamed for economic hardship, but Stevenson argues that it's not the main driver.
He says he's not an immigration expert, but he's concerned that anti-immigrant sentiment is being used to distract from the real problem, which is wealth inequality.
Like a magician using misdirection.
Exactly. He even suggests that some wealthy individuals might be quietly encouraging this narrative because it benefits them.
Because it takes the heat off of them.
Right. And while he acknowledges that immigration can have complex impacts, he's adamant that it's not the main reason for the massive surge in wealth at the top.
And he sees the focus on immigration as a way to divide the working class and prevent them from uniting to demand a fairer system.
It's a classic divide and conquer strategy.
So why isn't our political system addressing this issue of wealth concentration? Stevenson says it's partly because of the way economics is taught. He says there's too much focus on mathematical models that ignore inequality.
So people who go on to become economists and policymakers might not even be equipped to understand the problem.
And then there's the even bigger issue of who's actually involved in these economic discussions.
He points out that most of the people in those rooms, the economists, the politicians, the journalists, the academics, are in the top 1% themselves.
So they benefit from the status quo.
Exactly. And he says that creates a huge blind spot. They're like fish in water. They don't even see the problem.
And he gives examples like that Financial Times article that claimed inequality hadn't increased, which he says is just completely out of touch with reality.
Yeah, he's pretty scathing about that. He says the poorest 20% are struggling to put food on the table, and these people are living in a different world.
So if things are so bad for so many people, why aren't they voting for parties that promise to tax the rich?
Well, Stevenson says it's not necessarily that people aren't aware of the problem. He thinks they haven't been properly informed.
Because the media isn't talking about it.
Partly. And also because there isn't really a major political party in the UK right now that's seriously campaigning on a platform of taxing the wealthy.
So people don't really have a choice.
Not a meaningful one, anyway. And he sees the support for parties like Reform as a sign that people are desperate for change. But he worries that their policies would actually make things worse.
So what does he think needs to happen?
He believes that change has to start with educating the public about these economic issues.
And that's what he's trying to do with his own work.
Exactly. He feels a personal responsibility to speak out, especially coming from a working class background and having seen the inner workings of the financial system.
So as we've seen, Gary Stevenson paints a pretty thought-provoking picture of wealth concentration and its impact on the economy. He connects things like the slow recovery after 2008, the wealth gains during COVID, and the struggles of the middle class, all back to this one central issue.
And it's hard to ignore his point about the COVID spending. Trillions were pumped into the economy, but a lot of that money ended up right back in the hands of the wealthy.
Which makes you think about how money really works and how it tends to flow upwards when there's so much inequality.
And Stevenson's proposal for a 1% wealth tax on fortunes over £10 million is really interesting. He's not saying we need to take everything from the rich, but he thinks we need to rebalance the system.
And his analogy of the housing market is a great way to understand how this wealth disparity plays out in real life. It's like ordinary people are being priced out of the game by those who have so much more capital.
And he's skeptical of solutions that rely on just growing the economy or blaming immigration. He says we need to focus on the distribution of wealth itself.
And what's really compelling is that Stevenson's not just some ivory tower academic. He's speaking from his own experience, from his own background.
He's seen how the system works, and he's concerned about what it means for the future.
So this deep dive leaves us with a lot to think about. If this concentration of wealth at the top is really the root problem, what are the long-term consequences? And what, if anything, can we do about it?
It's a question worth pondering as we navigate this increasingly complex economic landscape.
It definitely is.